like to welcome all our participants, and I see that Father Polycarp is with us. I don't see yet Father Dr. Konstantin Rupini, but I hope he is also with us, and Father Professor Faustin Niomboir. Père professeur, je ne suis pas si, je ne vous vois pas. J'espère que vous êtes avec nous. So, not to waste time in introduction, I would like to welcome Father Polycarp Opio, who is our doctoral student at our Cardinal Wyszyński University, and this presentation will be dedicated to the concept of widowhood and wife inheritance in the Lango culture in Uganda. So, Father Polycarp, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Chloe, for inviting him and welcoming me. And thank you very much, participants who are in the hall and those online. As it has already on the concept of widowed and wife inheritance in the Lang culture of Uganda. And as a matter of introduction, who are the Lang people? The Lang people are a Nilotic ethnic group of northern Uganda, and according to oral traditions, originated from the Phalashas or Solomonic ancestry of Aksum in Abyssinia in about 900 AD. And trekking via Nazareth and Addis Ababa, arrived in that destination of Omo Valley, north of Rhodes in 1250. And so they spread in different parts of Ethiopia, Sudan, Kenya, Tanzania, and eventually they arrived the Lango of Uganda. So we have the Lango of Uganda, Lango of Ethiopia, Lango of Kenya, and Lango of Tanzania, just basic region. The Lang people live in Lang region, north central Uganda, the North Lake Kyoga. And according to 2014 census, their population is estimated to be 3.5 million people. A close study of overlooked oral and print sources indicates that the Lang of Uganda are not a homogeneous group. Instead, they are composed of people from diverse backgrounds. The local dialect that they speak is called Leblango, which is also understandable by the neighboring Acholi, Jopadola, Alur, Kumam, and Luo of Kenya. The Lang are agropastoral, relying on agriculture and livestock rearing since the olden times, and they have kept this up to date. And the common animals they keep are sheep, goat, cows, which are popular, and also they use these as a source for paying bride wealth. Now, understanding the concept of family according to the Lang people. The Lang, according to the Lang people, any man who has reached the age of maturity is expected to marry, and to stay without marriage when one has reached this age of maturity is a kind of abnormality and usually called for a cultural interpretation. The Lang is patrilineal society that upon payment of dowry, usually cows, goats, sheep, and chicken, and now also money, the woman is handed over to the man, and only then are they declared husband and wife. The woman leaves their home and joins the family of the husband. She becomes part of the husband's family. And in many cases, she also adopts the name of the husband as an indicator of being absorbed into the family. The Lang people value children to the extent that a child shielded marriage, and it was the woman who remained central in fulfillment of these. Hence, the need for a woman to be fertile. The fertility of a woman is proved by conception. This proves the thought that a woman is placed by God as a mother of humanity, dispenser and sustainer of life. So having a child made the family complete. As the challenges of life always offer, death can befall a family. And if man dies, the woman remains a widow. And if the wife died, the man becomes a widower. In the context of Lang society, several factors contributed to the causes of widows and widowhood. The area that Lang is situated experienced war for over 20 years under the rebel activity of the Lord's Resistance Army, which left many women and men as widows and widowers. Several men were abducted and taken to the bush as fighters and eventually died in the war fronts. But above all, there were several attacks in internally displaced camps with so many killings, with the major attacks being in a place called Balonio in February 2004, that we witnessed 337 dead bodies in one morning. But this was not the only attack in a camp. Several camps were attacked. According to the UN, the Lord's Resistance Army was responsible for more than 100,000 deaths, the abduction of between 60,000 to 100,000 children, and displacement of 2.5 million civilians by 2020. For the purpose of our discussion, we shall dwell more what affected more in causing the issues of widows. At a certain point, the Lord's Resistance Army decided to get men to go into war. And so many men were abducted and taken to the war as fighters, and they lost their lives, leaving women and children at home. The other notable cause that resulted to many being widows and widowers is the devastating effect of HIV/AIDS. Although the prevalent rates of HIV/AIDS have greatly improved in the Lang sub-region, Lang, a region in mid-northern Uganda, still stands at 7.2%, which is higher than the national average of 6.2 by 2021. The recent COVID-19, which ravaged the whole world, have certainly left many people widows and widowers. The Lang sub-region is not exclusive. The above are some of the major factors, although that have contributed to many women remaining single as widows. Although there are other minor ones like domestic violence, accidents, suicide, and other diseases like cancer, which have also contributed. But the above presents a vision of the Lang community as far as the leading causes of death leading to the status of widows are concerned. Now let us reflect on the plight of widows among the Lang culture. As I earlier mentioned, the Lang is a patrilineal society that by culture, the woman upon marriage, usually sealed by payment of bride wealth, leave their home and join the home and family of the husband. She loses her own family status and gains that of her husband. She loses all her shares from her own family, and she's expected to gain new shares from the husband's family. In the Lang culture, there is no cultural law that protects property inheritance by the widow after the death of the husband. Properties like land, which is very essential, houses and others, are usually allocated to the male child, who are invested with the rights of their father. Girls do not have the rights of inheritance. They are expected after a certain point that they get married and join the family of the husband. But in any case, they expect that the male children or the society would take care of them. In case the male child is young and cannot assume the responsibility, one of the uncles is assigned the duty as caretaker temporarily. In the traditional Lao culture, a widow is taken as a social outcast, and too often after the loss of the husband, she is stripped of her properties, including her children. And if she wishes to remain in her home and with her children, she has to submit herself to being inherited by one of the brothers of the husband or by one of the relatives. The children too, if not at the age of maturity, suffers in the hands of their relatives, especially deprived of customary land by the uncles, and they live at the mercy of their uncles. And in most cases, not supported enough to study, and girls encouraged to marry at an early age. It is only in some circumstances in the modern times that some women are empowered and are able to support the children, although still with difficulties and pressure imposed by the relatives of the deceased husband. It should be noted that in Uganda, we have a succession law, which gives provision for everyone living in Uganda to take on properties as per the succession law provides. But this is more in theory than in practice. In most cases, the law is underlooked and many people are ignorant about it. In Lao, this is left to the discretion of customary and religious leaders who rules and are legally binding and acceptable by all. The practice of writing a will is foreign in the culture of Lao people, and in most cases taken as a precursor to death. And so with such a mentality and ignorance of the law, many people settle for the decision of the elders, cultural leaders, religious leaders, or other relatives. In most cases, the widow's voice does not count in the distribution process. The official law which could favor the widow, unfortunately, plays little role, as the customary practice takes precedence. It is important to note that the customary law of the Lao people is rooted in the tradition of patrilinealism, which dictates that property should remain in the male line and be passed from son to son. In a patrilineal society like the Lao people, the father's family and clan determines a person's identity and status in the community. A newborn child, whether male or female, belongs to his or her father's clan. Women are disregarded in matters of property because the traditional notion is that the men of the community will support the women. When a girl grows into a woman and marries, she then becomes the property of her new husband. And any children she has are also considered to belong to her husband. The woman is essentially purchased by her husband's clan through the payment of bride price or bride wealth, as it is also known. This practice, which is prevalent in Uganda, is a practice by which the groom or his father offers wealth, mostly money or other property, in exchange for the approval of the bride's father or her clan to take her as a wife. By treating her as an outsider, as property instead of family, the clan can deny her inheritance rights when her husband dies and condition her continuous occupancy of the home on her agreement to be inherited by a male member of her deceased husband's clan. Having no property of her own, nowhere to go, and possibly having young children to raise, she will often submit to this practice of widow inheritance. In this first remarriage, a widow must fulfill all wifely duties, including sexual intercourse and domestic activities, such as child rearing and agricultural production. The above defines the status of widows in Lao society. Although in the recent years, the law of inheritance has been strengthened, a lot still needs to be done to protect the status of the widows in Lao society. Now, I give a brief reflection on the concept of wife inheritance. Wife inheritance is a cultural practice, social practice, which demands a widow be married by a male relative of her late husband. Most times, the brother to the late husband. Initially, the practice of wife inheritance among the Lao people had a positive mind. It was simply meant to protect and support the widow and her children in time of need. In the traditional Lao society, the woman had access to ancestral land only through the husband. If then at death of the husband, she was childless or had only girls, she needed attachment of a man so that she continues accessing what the husband left behind, and that the properties are, and the properties also. And this was positive. This was good in itself. It was a way of security for the widow and for the children. But because of the above, it found provision within the customary law that a widow and the children be protected and taken care of by the relatives of the husband. However, this was the ideal, but as time passes, most of the relatives came in to simply get their own satisfaction, grabbing the properties of the deceased and never protecting the widow, and also in some cases making sexual demands unnecessarily. It was also intended to enhance continuity of the family. If it happened, the man died without leaving children. The question is whether the woman is left with a choice or she is dictated upon. And unfortunately, she didn't have a choice to choose who to move out with. It is unfortunate that although the intended purpose of the customary law of the Lao people of wife inheritance had the positive reason, it has proven otherwise as we witness widow-headed families getting more poorer, properties being grabbed by relatives, widows being forced into sexual acts, in the case of will that protected the widows, and in most cases, the wills are disrespected. The effects of this are enormous. I give a few of them. Considering the initial intended purpose of customary law of wife inheritance, which was meant to protect the widow and her children, some sober-minded relatives have heeded to this purpose and have helped the widows and children entrusted to their care. This is on a positive note. It also created good social order in the family and community. The circumstance that would lead the widow into wandering about is controlled. However, supporting wife inheritance basing on the good action of a few sober people would be unwise, whereas there are so many notable negative effects.
Excuse me, Father Polka, could you just slowly go to the conclusion, please?
Yes. Now, as part of the negative, we see now that it has escalated HIV/AIDS in the area, and we already see the prevalence rate going very high in Lao sub-region. It has also led to loss of properties in many instances. It deprived the widows of their dignity and right to choose, and disregards the feelings of such widows. As a way of conclusion, the Lao culture is one thing I subscribe to, and as long as it is for the good of humanity, for culture gives me my identity. Although wife inheritance is important, especially for the purpose of the well-being of children, widow and protection of their properties, this essentially is good, but it needs people who are well-formed in conscience and heart. The Lao society have counted numbers of people who have portrayed otherwise. Hence, the need to enforce a strong law that would protect the widow, children, and their properties. Women should be empowered enough through social and widow groups. And I am happy the Diocese of Lira have formed a very strong widows group and have offered enough support to them. And the church is having this responsibility. To create good social order is important, to consider one's right of choice, and also be truthful before the consideration of wife inheritance. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity, and I beg to submit here.
Thank you very much for this interesting presentation, and please stay with us. At the end of the last presentation, we have time for perhaps some additions or questions, so thank you for this. And I see that Father Doctor, the young Doctor Konstantin Rupini is with us already. Could you show us yourself, and can you please, your microphone, please put it on so that the presentation will be on the plight of widows in Alur society in Uganda. So we stay in Uganda. Father, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Father Professor. I hope you are able to hear me clearly.
Yes, we hear you well and see you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Father Professor. So my presentation is about the plights of widows in Alur, Luo society of Uganda. And since the Luo people are not only limited to Uganda, some are found in Kenya, for instance, I will also talk briefly about the plights of widows in Kenya among the Luo people, but I will give a summary of all these. I will not give a very long presentation. So by way of introduction, I would like to say that, of course, death as a separation of the human soul from the human body is an inescapable reality. Specifically, with regard to the death of husbands in Alur, or rather Luo society in general, widows culturally find themselves in a more humiliating situation than in a breathtaking one. And so this presentation focuses on the plights of widows in Alur society of Uganda, but it will also consider some aspects of Luo society in Kenya. Now, let us look briefly at the sense in which widows belong to the lineage of the deceased husband before we can go to the plights of widows as such. Now, in Alur and Luo tradition in general, marriage gives a woman the legal right to work, to bear children, to her husband, and also to belong to the extended families, lineage and clan of the husband. But the sense of belonging to the family of the husband is not total, it is a limited one. She can participate in certain important activities of the husband's family, and she's restricted in others. And so, for the Alur widows, we can also talk briefly about that context. The term widow among the Alur is called Dato, which is Alur dialect of Luo language, which literally means wife of death. So Dato means wife of death. Now, the Luo of Kenya refers to a widow as Chiliel. Now, Chiliel literally means wife of the grave, but not widow of the grave or of death. So the Luo terminology for widow shows that the dead are alive, and death does not bring to an end the marriage of a woman. That is why, with the death of a husband, the marriage is not considered ended, but that a male relative of the deceased husband can inherit her, so that her marriage to the lineage or clan is perpetuated. And so culturally, it is claimed that the practice of inheriting widows was positively understood as a way of extending a helping hand to a nuclear family that has lost a father figure. So inheriting of widows was not meant for stealing from the bereaved family or grabbing their property. Now, although there is a positive consideration of widow inheritance, critics argue that most of the so-called inheritors are simply economic predators who are interested in inheriting, especially widows with valuable property and not poor widows. They inherit such widows not to assist and care for them and their family, but to perversely enjoy the material benefits and warmth of the quiet young widows. It is also important to know that some widows also behave perversely. Some of them steal resources of their deceased husbands, abandon their children and matrimonial home, and elope to enjoying themselves. Unfortunately, there is also this situation. Now let us go specifically to talk about the plights of widows in a Lur or Luo society, and I will give specifically 3 important areas of the plights of widows in a Lur or Luo society. The first area concerns the degrading mourning practices. After the death or with the death of the husband, there is mourning. And so what I would like to say is the degrading mourning practices among the Lur or the Luo society. Now, in Luo societies, a widow is supposed to properly follow cultural mourning rituals, which indeed signify the death of her husband. In a Lur society, a widow is culturally supposed to be somewhat shabby, with unkempt hair, and should wear somewhat dirty dresses. Now, among the Luo of Kenya, especially in Nyanza province, a widow whose husband has just died has to wear some of the clothes of her deceased husband as a way of preventing his spirit from disturbing her. Her head should be shaved as a sign of sadness, but also as a sign of honor and respect to the deceased husband. And she can also tie banana leaves around her waist as a sign of strength to go on, but also as a sign of her shabby appearance, and therefore as a sign of her unclean status. She's then taken to be ritually supposed to be cleansed from her ritual uncleanliness, which has been possibly brought about by the death of her husband. So in addition to the grief, which is directly related to the death of her husband, a widow's mourning period is marked by humiliating practices, as I have enumerated. The second plight of widows I would like to summarize is about widow cleansing ritual. Among especially the Luo of Nyanza province in Kenya, once the community has observed that the widow is properly mourning the deceased husband according to custom, the roof of her house is slightly altered or even damaged to further show the death of the head of the family. The woman is then isolated, stigmatized, and treated like an outcast who must be ritually cleansed. At this moment, her brother-in-law or cousin of the deceased husband, who is willing to cleanse and inherit her, goes to her in her isolated house and performs the ritual of widow cleansing, which involves unprotected sexual intercourse. The widow is required to have sexual intercourse with a male cleanser in order to remove any possible ritual impurity of the deceased husband or any other spirit associated with the deceased husband from interfering in her life. In fact, the law of Kenya believe that during widow cleansing, the ritual cleanser chases all the evil spirits which could have been responsible for the death of the husband of that particular woman. So by this ritual cleansing, the law believed that the widow, her inheritor, and the community will not be haunted by the spirit of the deceased man. Some of the ritual cleansers are strangers to the widows. That is, they are not in-laws, not relatives of the deceased husband, especially if no male relative of the deceased husband is willing to inherit her, yet the widow is supposed to be ritually cleansed. So the widow will have sex with a stranger. Some widows even use the so-called professional cleansers to perform the ritual. And so it is unfortunate that a widow may end up even having sexual intercourse with a professional cleanser or even with a person she doesn't know. And on top of that, she's supposed to pay them, to give them some money for the services. Of course, the practice of widow cleansing indeed degrades widows, in addition to other consequences such as infections with sexually transmitted diseases, such as HIV/AIDS. Hence, some widows, especially in towns and cities, or rather in urban areas in general, detest the ritual of widow cleansing. However, most widows, especially in rural areas, still observe the practice of ritual cleansing because they are afraid of the possibility of their children getting misfortunes and illnesses. The third element, which I would like to end with as a plight of widow, is the problem associated with widow inheritance. Of course, in a Luo and Luo society, inheriting of widows is still a common practice, as even Father Polycarp has talked about. But the Alur people also, unlike maybe some other few Luo people, especially the Luo of Nyanza province, once a widow inherits, the children belong to the new husband. But if the new husband is one of the relatives of the deceased man, then the children, of course, remain also within the lineage of the clan, so they are still related. But the point of concern I would like to talk about is that while a widow who accepts to be inherited to somewhat, is somewhat protected by the community and is left with some of the valuable property of the deceased husband, a widow who does not want to be inherited usually undergoes a lot of plights, a lot of suffering. The property left by the deceased husband is often grabbed by the relatives, especially the male relatives of the deceased husbands. Hence, the widow is often left without important property like houses, land, or even money. And sometimes the widow is sent even away from the patrilocal settlement. And her young children sometimes are forcibly taken away from her and then taken care of by the so-called uncles who sometimes even don't take good care of them. And so we see that sometimes the widows really suffer a lot with their children, and they end up leaving even the very home of the deceased husband. And so in order to effect the sending away of the widow from her deceased husband, sometimes even a widow is falsely accused of many evil practices, such as witchcraft and wizardry. And so in other words, the widow can be practically left empty. And so the cultural plights of widows, especially in rural Allur and in rural Luo communities in general, are enhanced by the vulnerability of widows due to patriarchal nature of Luo society, by which property is held in the male line, which promotes widows' lack of cultural property inheritance right and no stable sources of income for livelihood. So widows usually find it difficult to resist being inherited for fear of being sent away from the matrimonial homes, usually without settlements to the estates of their deceased husbands. And the brothers of the deceased husband take it as their cultural right to inherit the women for whom bride price has been paid. So this unfortunate experience of rural widows with practically no cultural, no property inheritance right, or even no or low level of formal education and exposure, no reliable source of income, is in contrast to some urban Allur or Luo widows in general. Many Luo urban areas are quite enlightened with the formal jobs, with the regular sources of income. So generally, such widows in urban areas, though still small in number compared to rural widows, tend to ignore the cultural conditions imposed on women, such as requirements of widow inheritance and guardianship. They are ready to legally fight back any person who wants to grab their husband's estates. But also I would like to state that in Uganda, there is what we call Succession Act, which legally protects women with regards to inheritance of family property. And in fact, 15% of the property of the deceased man is supposed to go to the widows. Unfortunately, sometimes these laws are just theoretical. The implementation is very minimal. And so following the described situation, it is also worth noting that there is some disconnection between the official government policy on succession of property rights and what is actually practiced, at least in a Allur society. So most widows still don't realize this constitutional right. I would like to end by giving some proposals, just some 3 proposals, and then I end with my presentation. The first proposal for managing plights of widows is to the church. Of course, the human person is created in God's image, and the church has a mission to defend the dignity of the human person. And so generally, unfair traditional treatment of widows and their young children contradicts Christian teaching, in which the care of widow is valued. Because we know that right in the early church, the apostles mandated deacons to care for especially material needs of widows by collection and distribution of alms. When we read the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 6, verse 1, in fact, the church positively teaches and cares for widows and orphans because they're generally a vulnerable group of people. So the church has a duty, especially the church in the Catholic diocese, and even in other parts of Luo, to recognize the dignity of both man and woman as created by God, and even to appeal to cultural leaders of the Luo groups to be fair in the treatment of widows. And then I would like to talk briefly about civil society. There are laws which can guard, the plight of widows. They are protected. So the appeal is also to governments, especially the government of Uganda, not just to make laws which remain theoretical, but there is also need for the implementation of laws which can protect widows, because some of the laws are already in existence. And lastly, my proposal would be to the cultural leaders. You know, Luo cultural leaders still have a lot of influence in Luo society. They are generally respected and listened to by their subjects. And so hence the church and even civil leaders can work with these cultural leaders in order to improve the situation of widows, and also to protect them, because the act of widow cleansing is very humiliating. You know, having sexual intercourse with a person you don't know, just for the sake of, you know, being readmitted into the community is unfair. In conclusion, it is true that there are many Alur and Luo cultural practices which do not promote fair treatment of widows, such as degrading mourning practices, widow cleansing practices, unfair property inheritance rights, among others. However, I would like also to state that not everything is dark for widows in Alur and Luo society. There are also some fair treatment of widows, which also we need to appreciate. And so not everything is dark. And for the dark areas, it is my appeal to the church, civil governments, and non-governmental organizations, and even other stakeholders to work hard to make widows also to realize their worth, that they are of dignity and they need to be respected and fit in the community. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Father Constantine. And also, I just wanted to say in a moment, please go to the conclusion, but you did it before. So thank you very much also for this discipline of time. And we can have some time after next presentation. Now I would like to invite, maintenant, je voudrais inviter Père Professeur Faustin Wamboire. Si vous êtes avec nous, s'il vous plaît, donnez-nous le signe. If Father Professor Faustin Wamboire is with us, please show us that you are here. And yes, I see that you are, but we would like to see also your face. Si vous pouvez montrer-nous aussi.
Allumer les caméras, s'il vous plaît.
Ah oui, allumer les caméras, s'il vous plaît.
Oui.
Oh, merci. Alors, merci pour votre présence. Et, nous avons des présentations de Ouganda maintenant au parcours Rwanda. We had two presentations from Uganda. Now we go to Rwanda, and the presentation on the cultural leverage in traditional Rwanda society. Alors, professeur, maintenant c'est le temps pour vous.
Merci bien, je vous salue, bonjour. J'espère que vous me voyez.
Oui.
On se voit? Moi, je vous vois bien.
Oui, oui.
Merci. Mon intervention, c'est sur le lévira dans la culture du Rwanda traditionnelle, d'une pratique coutumière à une éthique de solidarité responsable. La pratique du lévira est connue dans plusieurs sociétés avant la généralisation des codes standardisés sur le régime matrimonial. Et le Rwanda ne fait pas exception à cette règle, que ce soit dans la période coloniale ou même un peu après. Mais la spécificité, justement, dans le cas du Rwanda, réside dans le modèle de la famille qui est typique. Depuis les démarches en vue de la constitution de la jeune famille jusqu'au rite religieux quand il y a disparition de l'un des conjoints, en passant par toute une série de valeurs et d'interdits mis en œuvre pour en assurer le bon fonctionnement et en garantir la survie. Car dans le cas du Rwanda, la famille, une fois constituée, ne s'éteint jamais. Donc, l'enjeu de notre propos ici est de montrer comment, d'une pratique apparemment sans autre horizon que la coutume et ses articulations automatiques, on est passé à une vraie éthique de la solidarité et une solidarité responsable. Bien sûr que je ne voudrais pas idéaliser tout d'un modèle qui n'existe plus aujourd'hui, mais je veux convier à partir de la conclusion à une sensibilité à l'égard des personnes fragiles, malgré les apparences et les discours exaltant le progrès actuel, pour être délivré de ce qu'on appelle aujourd'hui la globalisation de l'indifférence. Bon, j'aurais voulu rappeler certaines constantes de la famille au Rwanda, mais je passe directement aux conditions et au sens du lévira au Rwanda traditionnel. Bon, nous rappelons qu'avant l'arrivée des Occidentaux et de l'indépendance politique qui surviendra après, le pays connaissait une monarchie de type féodal. Et il arrivait souvent que l'homme adulte vive longtemps loin de son foyer, soit en suivant son maître dans ses randonnées, soit en attendant à la cour royale son tour d'être reçu en audience pour présenter certaines doléances, ou alors au travail pour assurer à la famille de meilleures conditions de subsistance. Dans le cas de jeunes foyers, ceci implique que la femme restait seule à la maison ou y restait avec des enfants très jeunes. Plus l'absence est longue, plus la solitude est ressentie et les moyens de subsistance se raréfient. Et aussi, l'éducation des enfants qui ont besoin de la présence du père est compromise. En d'autres termes, la femme est fragilisée ou le foyer est à risque si les enfants ont cette carence du point de vue psychopédagogique. Mais la société, dans les valeurs de la famille, a tout prévu. Comme dans la perception commune, la femme mariée appartient à toute la famille de son époux, on va envoyer le jeune frère du mari absent, ou l'un des jeunes frères, s'il en a plusieurs, passer la nuit chez la femme, esselée pour briser la solitude et éviter toute intrusion. Personne, y compris le mari lui-même, absent, ne verra d'un mauvais œil le fait que quelqu'un passe la nuit chez lui, même avec sa femme. Et si le mari n'a pas de petit frère, son propre père, donc le beau-père de la femme, viendra de temps en temps se faire voir pendant la journée. Comme ça, l'entourage sait que la femme est en question et protégée. Et les enfants en bas âge ne souffriront pas de cette carence de l'absence du père. Ici, quand avec l'arrivée des missionnaires au Rwanda, comme cette pratique était courante, on se rappelle par exemple dans le code des grands séminaires, on insistait pour que le grand séminariste n'aille pas chez son frère si celui-ci est absent, parce que c'était normal que disons que sa belle-sœur est considérée par la société comme sa femme avec tous les droits. Revenons à ce sens de la solidarité. Si par exemple l'habitation du foyer s'en vient à être endommagée par des intempéries, en l'absence du père du foyer, les jeunes frères du mari vont donner le ton pour donner un coup de main et redresser la situation. Cela donne comme message que la femme qui a été dotée par la famille lui appartient vraiment, puisque même en l'absence de son mari, sa protection n'est pas compromise. Ce qui est dit ici des frères directs du mari ou de son père sera assuré par les membres de la famille élargie si le mari n'a pas de frère direct ou n'a pas de père. De même, s'il y a des rites religieux à accomplir, nous sommes encore dans la religion traditionnelle, et qui nécessitent normalement la présence du conjoint, en son absence, la substitution se fera dans l'ordre donné plus haut, des frères du mari ou son père, même si dans le cas des frères du mari, on n'a qu'un enfant mineur, par exemple. Ici, nous comprenons bien, et il convient de le souligner, que dans tous ces cas, la présence n'implique pas nécessairement un acte conjugal ou similaire. Ce qui précède, on peut déjà déduire que dans le cas du décès du mari, pour une large mesure, on ne fait que mettre en application à un plan plus officiel et durable ce qui se pratiquait déjà pendant les absences temporaires du mari de son vivant. Mais il y a d'autres points à étayer. Et nous en arrivons au lévirat proprement dit. S'il était bien retenu que la femme appartenait à la famille du mari, ceci recèle des droits et des devoirs. Ou plutôt, dans le cas proprement dit qui nous concerne, des limites de droit. Nous l'avons dit, la femme mariée légitimement et légalement a le droit d'être protégée, d'être nourrie. On peut dire le droit de sécurité pour elle et pour ses enfants. Ceci veut dire en quelque sorte que, en l'absence de son mari, elle n'a pas le droit de disposer ni de son temps, ni de son espace comme elle l'entend. Comme déjà insinué aussi, ses enfants appartiennent au mari et à la famille de celui-ci. Autrement dit, la femme n'a pas de droit sur ses propres enfants. Par ailleurs, dans une société où le droit de succession, d'héritage, ne fait que peu de cas des femmes, celle-ci n'a pas de bien propre. Tout ce qu'elle est censée posséder, après la mort de son mari, si elle devient veuve, tout ce qu'elle est censée posséder revient juridiquement à ses enfants ou à la parenté du mari. Donc, en cas de décès du mari, la femme n'a ni bien et n'a ni aucun droit sur ses enfants. La veuve n'ayant pas d'héritage propre et n'ayant pas de droit sur ses enfants, on comprend que après le décès de son mari, elle est dépossédée de tout. Elle n'a pas le droit d'être indépendante parce que si elle décide d'épouser un autre homme qui n'a aucune relation familiale avec son premier mari, elle doit quitter son foyer, abandonner ses enfants et tous ses biens à son ancienne belle famille. Pour subsister donc, et même pour continuer à avoir le droit sur les biens de son mari et surtout pour continuer à avoir un lien officiel et des droits sur ses propres enfants, elle doit rester dans la famille du mari. Si elle décidait d'épouser un autre homme, en dehors de la famille du mari, nous venons de le dire, elle perd ipso facto le statut d'épouse dans la famille et le statut de mère de ses enfants. si elle veut épouser un membre de la famille du mari, mais ne veut pas non plus épouser quelqu'un d'autre ailleurs, elle est vouée à toutes les peines, ne pouvant que retourner dans sa propre famille de provenance où elle n'aura pas non plus d'héritage, seuls les enfants mâles ayant le droit d'héritage. C'est finalement pour elle une déchéance totale, économique, morale et sociale. Dans cette situation, le lévirat n'est pas seulement pour la veuve une planche de salut, mais une garantie de continuer à mener une vie humaine digne et surtout de garder une relation de mère avec ses propres enfants. Et j'en arrive à ce que le lévirat en société rwandaise a de spécifique, ce que j'ai appelé une portée éthique. La pratique du lévirat en tradition rwandaise vient combler un vide qui va au-delà du social pur, mais s'inscrit dans le sens d'une éthique de la solidarité. Nous devons rappeler que dans la société rwandaise traditionnelle, la femme quand même avait un rôle important et irremplaçable dans la famille. Ce n'est pas dit officiellement, mais dans la tradition, on le sait. Donc, on dit par exemple que la femme est le cœur du foyer. Et on comprend que si le mari est la tête, une tête sans cœur n'aurait pas de valeur. Alors, ce sont les vertus que la tradition réserve à la femme qui vont retransparaître dans ce que j'appelle cette éthique de la solidarité. Alors, que nous apporte l'éthique du lévirat en cela? Je dis d'abord je dis essentiellement trois choses. Dans la société rwandaise, le lévirat, tout en étant une coutume bien ancrée, restait quand même facultatif. C'est-à-dire, la femme pouvait choisir d'épouser un membre de la famille du mari et garder tous ses privilèges, les droits sur les biens, les droits sur ses enfants, mais pouvait aussi abandonner et les enfants et les biens et aller se marier ailleurs. Elle avait le droit de choisir de rester ou de partir, bien sûr, avec toutes les implications que nous venons d'énoncer. Secundo, en proposant à la femme le lévirat, on lui proposait, on ne lui imposait pas. On voulait certes le bien de la famille, surtout l'honneur de la famille, mais aussi celui de la femme et des enfants. Parce qu'une famille que la veuve quittait aussitôt après la mort du mari, cela voulait dire que la famille ne l'avait jamais bien intégrée. Donc, ça mettait un point, disons, un questionnement sur les valeurs humaines de cette famille du mari. Une femme qui partait ainsi aurait été la proie de tous les maux et la proposition du lévirat avait donc comme objectif de l'en préserver et de la protéger en la gardant au chaud du foyer. Pour les enfants, il n'y avait pas de pire malheur que de devoir être confié à l'éducation de la mère d'autrui, donc une maman qui n'est pas leur propre maman. Cela équivalait à être déjà orphelin avant la lettre. Donc, pour le bien des enfants aussi, le lévirat intervenait. Il fallait que la tendresse maternelle en la première personne ne fasse pas défaut. Et le nouveau mari de la femme, disons dans le cas du lévirat accepté, était considéré comme père des enfants, même ceux qui étaient déjà nés, père à part entière, tout en sachant, disons, on savait bien qu'il n'en était pas le géniteur, mais juridiquement, il était comme le père. Tertio, et c'est peut-être la plus grande originalité. Dans la culture rwandaise, on connaissait aussi une forme de lévirat blanc, c'est-à-dire que des fois, et même souvent, ce nouveau mariage n'était pas destiné à être consommé, mais visait seulement les garanties juridiques telles que nous venons de dire dans le point précédent. Que le nouvel époux soit majeur ou mineur, des fois même un tout petit enfant, l'essentiel résidait dans les garanties juridiques que la femme a un autre mari dans la famille. Ça visait donc l'assurance de protection et de dignité pour la femme et respect envers sa famille de provenance, ainsi qu'une éducation socialement et psychologiquement complète et exempte de frustration et de complexes pour les enfants. Dans les manifestations publiques et dans les pratiques rituelles, une pareille femme n'était pas considérée comme une veuve. Elle avait un mari, même si c'était un enfant mineur qui vivait encore chez ses parents. Et ces enfants n'étaient pas orphelins, même si, à vrai dire, tout n'était réel qu'au niveau symbolique. D'où, et j'en arrive à ma conclusion, j'affirme que le lévira en société rwandaise traditionnelle était passé du statut de simple pratique coutumière, comme on en connaît partout ailleurs, à l'ouverture d'une éthique de solidarité responsable axée sur la dignité des personnes fragilisées, en l'occurrence la veuve et ses enfants, et la garantie d'un avenir meilleur, donc, pour les générations montantes. Sans vouloir forcer la note, et loin de vouloir canoniser toutes les pratiques d'une société qui n'était pas sans défaut, on pourrait évoquer ici aussi un cas de ces pierres d'attente dont nous parlons dans l'histoire des missions, les pierres d'attente, en contre-pied de ce qui est adopté aujourd'hui comme globalisation de l'indifférence. Car ici, dans cette tradition du lévira, nous retrouvons la sensibilité, l'attention et la générosité d'une culture qui a le souci de la veuve et de l'orphelin. Il est heureux que l'Église, après de longues hésitations, ait salué une telle pratique en l'accompagnant pour éviter de possibles travers. Et d'ailleurs, après ce qui est arrivé avec la tragédie que notre pays, le Rwanda, a connue en 1994, le souci de la veuve et de l'orphelin est devenu l'une des priorités pastorales dans l'Église catholique d'ici. Je vous remercie.
Merci beaucoup pour cette présentation. Et maintenant, on va le temps de questions. Thank you very much for your presentation. And now we have a few minutes for the time of questions to our speakers, to our presenters. So my first question is, let's see, so we have the time for the questions to be okay, if we don't have yet, I would like to start with one. Practically in all of those three presentations, we had a question of some kind of a ritual, special ritual for a widow. Well, there is a ritual funeral, but of course we have a ritual of consecration of widows. That's more Christian perspective. It's not very largely developed, but the previous conferences we had, Father Struzik mentioned this Polish reality. But do we have anything, a kind of a special ritual for the widow after the funeral, of course? So that would be a question to all of the speakers. Père Faustin, est-ce que vous comprenez anglais?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, so it's easier for me to speak English.
Yeah, I understand.
So, okay, so this is a question for all three presenters. So if you would like to comment on this or
I can start. We have in the Rwandan culture, we don't have a special ritual for widows. We had a ritual of the mourning in the family after the departure of the man. The ritual was concerning the whole family. But in this case, the widow was not allowed to present herself alone, where there was a need to have someone to simulate that she has already a new husband in order to accomplish the ritual of the mourning. And it was symbolic. It was not yet the levirate as said, but to simulate that someone is besides the widow to accomplish the ritual of the mourning in the family.
Thank you very much. And do we have something similar in Uganda, either in the church or in the society? I don't know if Father Polycarp or Father Pini would like to comment on this.
Thank you, Father Professor. As I said in the presentation, among the allure, there was the mourning practice and not specific ritual. But among the Luo of Kenya, especially Nyanza province, after mourning, and especially after the burial of the deceased husband, there is what they call widow cleansing ritual. And they do that for especially, I can say, two reasons. The first one is to prevent any spirit that could have been involved in the death of the husband. Because somehow there is the belief that a person could have died because of some unfortunate circumstance of intervention of some evil spirits. And, but also they do it in relation to in relation to preventing the very spirit of the husband who has died, so that the spirit does not come again to intervene in the life of this widow, and even in the one who is likely to inherit the widow. But they do the ritual by carrying out even unprotected sexual intercourse. The point is about sexual intercourse by the one who is supposed to inherit the woman. That is according to the law of Nyanza province in Kenya. And if there is no person from among the relations, those relatives of the husband of that person who has died, the widow is supposed to get at least another person she loves to carry out this ritual, this cleansing, by having sexual affair, sexual intercourse with her, to prevent the spirit of the husband who has died from again interfering in her problems or in her life and in the life of the children and any possible spirit that could have killed the husband. And if there is no other person, the widow can then, pay for the service of the so-called professional, widow cleansers. Now, these are people she's completely not related to, and also they will have these rituals and so as to prevent the so-called spirit. So, but this is done after the burial of the husband who has died.
Thank you. I'm not sure if Father Polycarp would like to add anything to this. That could be similar.
It is something similar in this, except what is also very specific during the widow cleansing among the Lao people is the sprinkling of the widow. Usually the widow smears herself with ashes after 3-4 days, depending on the agreed day. And then one of the elders comes with water at the doorsteps, and the widow is ushered out of the house. Meanwhile, they sprinkle her and also make some pronunciations that the spirit of the husband should not come and attack her and all those who will relate with her. And pronunciations that she should be protected from any other evil attack. So it is more inclined to the widow. But also after this cleansing, she should be able in a few days identify with the person that has been proposed to her. And in most cases, the one who takes priority is the people who take priority are the brothers of the deceased husband. It ends up, the cleansing process ends up in the inheritance itself. This is as far as the Lao community is concerned.
Okay, thank you very much. If I well understand all those three answers, so these are kind of rituals which can help the widow to be, again, a member of the society. But can we offer something like, I just mentioned, this ritual of consecration of widows, well, Christian. So is it possible to have not only just the cleaning process, but adding something more, as giving us a special place in society, of course, within a special framework? Is it possible to see a widow in a position kind of a leader or kind of guidance for some other people who are not in this position? So is it possible to see the situation of the widow not only as a weaker, but in somehow ready to take a special role in society? Yes, Father, please. Father Faustin, please. Yes.
Oui, c'est vrai que j'ai parlé de la société du Rwanda traditionnelle, mais je voudrais préciser que, comme je l'ai mentionné d'ailleurs, depuis la tragédie que notre pays a connue en 1994, nous avons beaucoup de veuves qui dirigent, qui sont chefs de ménage, beaucoup d'enfants qui sont chefs de ménage. Et ce type de consécration, comme dans la tradition chrétienne, de consécration des veuves a déjà lieu. Nous avons des veuves qui sont chefs de ménage de leur famille, des veuves qui ne sont pas contraintes au lévirat comme c'était dans le temps, et des veuves qui dirigent des familles et qui sont reconnues, donc l'institution des veuves dans l'église comme on en connaît déjà au temps de Saint-Ambroise ou autres. C'est déjà en acte et ça porte des fruits parce que, bon, c'est que notre pays est exemplaire déjà pour ce qui est du respect de la dignité de la femme, qu'on trouve dans beaucoup d'oppositions, même dans le gouvernement et dans le Parlement. Dans l'Église aussi, nous avons cette pratique de consécration des veuves et ça porte des fruits positifs. Merci.
Yes, I was just saying on this line because in the 19th century in Poland there were quite a few wars and many men were killed. In many situations there were women, sometimes widows, who took care about the life of many people. So that's why there was quite a high position of women, because many women were responsible for keeping the family and for big practical business. So something like I hear from Rwanda, and I'm just wondering now, looking at the war in Ukraine. So perhaps also many women will take a new role, even the widows. So is something similar in the experience of Uganda, or perhaps you didn't have such many wars last time? But so there were less men, and so women also the widows took a special role in the society.
Yes, in Uganda, it's in two ways. In the political field, widows are usually despised, and in most cases, you find that people first ask the background of anyone who comes to contest. And the question is, who is the husband? And in the occurrence that she has no husband, it is used against her that she is not even married. People do not understand the circumstance why she is like that. So in the political field, they're despised. But we have spotted cases like this, that even women of this type have still ended up taking on leadership. Whereas in the church, I mentioned that in my area, we experienced war for over 20 years. We have so many widows around. The church considered that for someone to take on the leadership role of a Christian community, that person must have been wedded in the church. But in the communities whereby we don't have people of this category, I've also witnessed that opportunities have been given to single women, widows, who are living sacramental life. So there are also quite a number of Christian communities that women have taken on leadership roles and responsibilities, and they do quite well. But apart from that, in my diocese now, there is a widows group which falls under women's desk, and is a big group of women who are also being very helpful in the church. So these widows are actually helpful and taking on leadership role. Thank you.
I see Father Rupin would like to add something. Yes, please.
In relation to the positive role of women, I would like to say something from a cultural point of view. In my society of the Allure, widows, generally speaking, are not looked at positively. And more still, if a widow has not accepted to be inherited, that is even worse, because she can be tortured in various ways by the close relatives of the deceased husband. So generally, they are not looked at positively. And as I've said, was still those who have not been inherited from a cultural perspective. However, this does not mean that widows are not involved in positive things. There are many positive things they do. For instance, even if one is not inherited, there are many who still take care even of their children, even if from really childhood, and they help. And they help those children to grow up well, even if they're not being supported by the brothers and sisters and relatives of the deceased husband. But they help, they do a lot, even if they're despised. of course, in the church, that's another thing. Now there's a positive view of women, especially widows, the association of widows and so forth. But from a cultural perspective, generally in my culture, unfortunately, even when you talk about the sanctification of women, the purification, yeah, but it is, they are general now, somehow accepted, but they have been culturally looked at quite negatively, unfortunately. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you very much for those answers. And do we have some other new questions, or perhaps those our presenters would like to add something summarizing this short discussion? Okay, so we still have a few minutes, but it is a long time. So I think that some people at this conference could be tired. So if we don't have a question, I think we can finish a few minutes earlier. So I would like to thank all our presenters in this last session, also in the previous sessions, and in the name of the organizers of the Institute of John Paul II Institute, the chair of missiology, our university, of the chair of moral theology and family of the university in Olsztyn and Jordan University College in Tanzania, and the Society of Polish Association of Polish Missiologists and Institutum Macedonianum, and as well as the portal Misyjne.pl. I would like to thank all the people present, all our presenters and all participants. And at this moment, I think we can